Hello, everybody. This is Jim MacPherson. I'm stepping in for Reed Price today as a kind of a backup. I'll be running the board for something to talk about. Ann Lovejoy is doing yeoman's work this week. This is her third of three STTAs, as we like to call them, this week, with her guest, Audrey Barbakoff, who she will introduce and talk all about. First, let's uh, say thanks to our sponsors here. Something to Talk About is sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers assisted and independent living along with a vibrant memory care community, and it's located on a tranquil rolling bay campus. It's a beautiful place. You go visit. It's really terrific. Fieldstone also has day stay and respite care programs. You can call them at 206 594 1010, or you can email Ashley C at fieldstonecommunities.com. But the easiest is just to check them out at their website, which is obviously fieldstonecommunities.com. And you can drop by for a tour. We'd also like to acknowledge that we meet on the ancestral homeland of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water. The Suquamish have lived on the water of the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them and are learning from their stewardship of these lands and waters. And now, before I do pass it on to Ann, I would like everybody to mute their Zoom because when you speak, it causes you to become the central picture, and we don't want to take anything away from Audrey and Ann. So, with that in mind, I will mute myself and pass it on to you, Ann.
But Audrey, you can unmute. So thanks everybody who sees this later. Audrey and I actually worked together at the public library. In fact, we had our training on the same day. Do you remember that? Right?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
I knew, of course, that we worked together at the library, but I don't think I realized that was that we were training together.
You actually were sitting next to me, and I thought, this is an interesting person who's going to do some cool stuff. And sure enough, you do. So first of all, thank you so much for coming. And I would love it if you could. I've had a bunch of questions when I said what we were going to talk about. They said, well, what do librarians even do today? Like, are libraries still relevant? And I know that you are a passionate believer in libraries being the heart of the community, right? So could you just give us a few minutes about what it's like to be a librarian in today's world of multimedia experiences?
Absolutely, I love that. So I think for folks who maybe haven't set foot in a library in a little while, there's maybe a perception that people aren't using libraries as much or in the same way. And if you come in and visit, you will see that is just not true. Libraries are bustling and are being used in a wide variety of ways. And so being a librarian means serving a lot of those needs. So at any one moment, you walk into the library, you might find someone coming in looking for a fun book that they can read over the weekend or that they can recommend to a friend or maybe a parent who's stuck at home, maybe someone who's ill, right? They want to find something fun for them to read and bring to them. You might have someone who has gone back to school who's using one of the computers to take a test. You might have someone working on their resume and trying to print. At the same time, you've got an educational program going on in the meeting room where folks are coming together and finally being able to be together again in physical spaces, right? Enjoying both the learning and the community. At the Bainbridge Library, you head down the stairs and there are just kids everywhere, right? Exploring books, picking out things for school, playing games, meeting other kids, finding books that allow them to explore their own interests and develop their literacy skills, as well as start to learn about themselves and who they are. So all of those kinds of things are going on all at once. And if you are working there as a librarian or in any other role, you are working to support and connect all of those folks to get them the information and the resources that they need to be successful in whatever their own goals are.
Today, of course, I was at the library since it's Friday, and we've been doing the Friday Tidy for 27 years now outside in the gardens. But when I was walked in, there was some kids, young kids, who looked like they were maybe 10, 12, 13 in there. And they had this stack of books, and they were asking for help in choosing the funniest LGBTQ romance novels for young teens. And the librarians were like, oh, we're so on it. And they pulled out a bunch of stuff. And then there's somebody else who's going to Thailand and needs help to find the books for where they're going, right? And then you're right. Somebody else was like, well, I'm trying to read a book to my mom and she has a hard time following. So what do you, right? And so you're right. You're like part psychologist,
Mhm.
right? Part therapist, part,
Part
and,
Geek Squad.
yeah. And it was so wonderful to watch like the staff just stepping right up. I remember one of the things I really loved about COVID is that I could go to the branch and there was this table outside and everyone was masked and I'd say, so next week, could you make me a bundle of books for my grandkids on blah, 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 blah. And sure enough, they would put together the most amazing stack, right? So you, as a librarian, you're also writing books now for librarians and teachers, right?
I am. I will say, first of all, though, Anne, there is no way to bring more joy to a librarian's heart than asking them to put together a set of books for you about a topic. So that's not just a COVID thing. For anyone listening, go up to that desk and say to the librarian, I want a bunch of books about whatever it is, right? Just like you did, just like those teams did, and you will make their day. That is one of our favorite things to do. So, but yes, I do write books both for children and for librarians. So my most recent book for librarians is called The 12 Steps to a Community-Led Library, and it's based on the research from my doctoral dissertation about how do libraries become more equitable, diverse, and inclusive by centering the voices of their communities in planning for their programs and services.
And that can be tricky depending on the community, right? I mean, you have to be able to read your community to know how to bring in books that are going to be appropriate for the, what do you know, the people, the patrons, right?
Absolutely. And I think, more broadly, beyond just the collection itself, beyond the books themselves, libraries do so many things, right? We have programs, we offer individualized assistance to folks. So in all of those, we're a really important physical space in the community, a place where people gather, come together, whether that's to use a meeting room or access really fast Wi-Fi or do the puzzle, right? That everyone has a shared puzzle on the table. Just to be around other humans and feel connected. So for any of those things, the space, the programs, the services, the collections, rather than making assumptions or guesses about what our community might want, thinking about who are the folks who are least served, the folks who are excluded now, and how do we put their voices at the center of making decisions about the services and programs and spaces that they will use.
That is so important because you can't set the table if you don't know what people want to eat,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, you got to make sure that you're putting out what is really going to serve the community, not what you think or what used to or what, somebody else tells you to. It's like you got to really have an ear to the community, which I think that's, you're right. A lot of librarians and teachers also really do try to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So do your books, what do you develop guidelines? Do you kind of suggest, tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so for this current book, and for a lot of, so now I'm not working directly in libraries anymore these days. I'm mostly doing consulting with libraries and with library-related organizations to help them make these changes, right? As you say, librarians really want to do this work, and it's a matter of understanding what it looks like and how we can do it effectively. So this came from, I did research with librarians from public libraries of different sizes all over the country in different types of communities, and looked at what are the factors that really helped them be successful in centering their communities and in doing things with people rather than for them or at them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I looked at what were the things that got in their way. So the book is a series, is a 12 different factors. And some of those are, many of those are organizational, right? Like what can the library as a workplace or as a system do in terms of how does it provide people with the autonomy, the flexibility, the resources to do this work? And some more individual, like what are the kinds of topics people need to learn about in order to be empowered to do this work?
Yeah, because it wasn't probably part of basic training in library school for a lot of people who've been out of library school for quite a while, right? I think
Absolutely.
that's changed a good deal in the last couple decades for sure. So part of it is sort of like, what do ongoing education, right? Helping
Absolutely.
people adapt to some, and what's your response? I mean, you talk to a lot of groups of librarians, right?
Absolutely. People are really receptive to this approach and they're really excited about it. As soon as they have some practical tools or they
Yeah.
have a clearer vision for how they can make this happen in their libraries, and it's not just an abstract idea, they are off to the races. And they can't wait to start, working with communities. That's what libraries and librarians are for, right? There's no agenda. It's a public resource. We're just there to get you what you need in the way that you need it. So as soon as librarians have more tools that help them do that more effectively, they're running.
You know what? I've always loved that about I remember years ago, a young kid friend said he'd lost the library card and he was really concerned. And he said, if we don't have our library card, where will we get our knowledge? This is an 8-year-old, and he's already figuring out that when you need to know something, you go to the library. And I think for me and for some people of my generation, it's been a little hard to watch something of a shift from books. I'm still a really solid book person, to other forms of media. And yet, obviously that's what's happening, and you got to go with it as a librarian, right? But, so where's the balance there for, I mean, I still love to go downstairs and in the kids' room and watch the kids lie on the floor with their books piled around them and just be lost in bliss, right? And I don't think you can do that as easily with a device. I don't know. Maybe that's a generational bias on my part. What do you think, though? Books are still there, right?
Absolutely. And as both a librarian and a mom, if you walk into my house, there's a fairly good chance you're going to be immediately injured by tripping over a large stack of books that is in the middle of the floor or tipping off the table. And I love nothing more than seeing my 4.5-year-old just like diving into a book. He's recently discovered graphic novels, and we were reading one together this morning. He, dragged it up into the bedroom in the morning, and like we were woken up to being like hit in the forehead with a book. Like, read this, mommy. So that is wonderful, and that is absolutely still incredibly relevant. Books are not going anywhere. Especially for younger kids, but really for anyone. There's actually been some interesting research showing that kind of your Gen Z, right, folks who are just on the cusp of adulthood now, actually still have a preference for physical books, even more so than my generation of millennials. That there's been a little bit of a tipping back. And there's some studies that show that we retain information a little bit better when it's in print, because we have those spatial cues as well. So books are not going anywhere.
That's interesting, because I have noticed that myself, that I can't learn from a screen as well as I can learn from a book. But I didn't realize that was not just me, that it's a thing, right?
Absolutely. That is how our brains work, at least for now. But as a librarian, I do feel like what I'm there to do is to get people information. And sometimes that information, the best way to get that information is in a book. And sometimes the best way to get it is online. And sometimes the best way to get it is from another human being, right? Or from an organization. So it's just one more other types of media, or just more tools in the tool belt.
I even remember a program we did here at Bainbridge Library that was you borrowed a person. There were like a bunch of us sat there who did things. I was a garden designer. There was a police chief. There was I can't remember all that. There was a poet, and kids could come in and like sit with you for 5 minutes and ask you what you did and how you did it, right? And I thought, wow, that's really inventive. But that's right. It makes things come alive for kids in a different way. So one thing I was thinking about a lot is, so it's Passover, right? And one of the things, we've done several programs on passing down traditions and how sometimes that's getting harder. Like I'm hearing people say, we've done some podcasts with families that said, oh, when my grandmother was alive, we had these huge seders and there'd be 100 people and and telling these wonderful stories. And I was like, so, and your kids do that now? And they're like, well, not so much. But I think your children's books are kind of geared to, my impression anyways, like sort of reinterpreting some traditional stories for kids today in ways that they'll find relevant. Is that right?
Absolutely. So coming from that similar place, and I was so excited. So Helm is a town from Jewish folklore. There are lots and lots of stories that have been passed down for generations, mostly from Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, who tell stories about this town of Helm. And the backstory of that is, at the time of creation, an angel is flying with the bag full of foolish souls. It contains all the foolish souls, ready to be sprinkled evenly around the world. And when the angel gets to Helm, they trip and all the foolish souls spill out into one place. So Helm is a town full of fools. So they're funny stories, they're silly, and I was excited to share them with my kiddos. But when I went back and looked at them again, and the versions, the most famous versions are the ones that Isaac Bashevis Singer was really the one who brought these into consciousness in English and in the U.S. And when I went back to those originals, I thought, I just don't think that my boys are gonna connect with this.
Mm-hmm.
It's set in, a long ago, far away kind of shtetl culture, and all of the characters are adults, and a lot of the problems that they deal with are kind of adult problems. And even though they're funny and I'm enjoying them, I thought, I just don't think this is going to land with my son. My youngest being too little at this point to care one way or the other. But although you can never start reading to them too early.
Right.
So I thought, well, what if there was a story where the protagonists were kids? And then I thought, well, what if the kids actually are really clever? What if it's only the adults who are foolish, right? What if it's a new generation in Helm? So that was really the impetus for writing this book. And then I thought, well, as long as we're thinking about how to help modern kids connect with this story, see themselves in these stories, it should be set in the modern day as well. So I envisioned a Helm that is urbanizing, that is diverse, right? That's a global community, just like many of our cities and towns and communities today.
So that's great. So how many have you've done a couple, right?
Nope, this is the first one, but there are many Helm stories out there in the world, so hopefully Sam and Sarah Schlemiel will get to have another few adventures in the future.
Oh, that's great. So who's your cast?
Yeah, so the folk tale that this is based on, so the traditional last name for a character in Helm, kind of a main character, is Schlemiel. So Shmuel Schlemiel is usually kind of the main guy. And if you're a Laverne and Shirley fan ever, Schlemiel. Schlemazel. Right. So Schlemiel is also like it's an insult, right? It's like an incompetent person.
Right.
So the original folk tale is, there's a few different versions of this one, but essentially the core of it is that that Shmuel Schlemiel and the townfolk of Helm mistake the reflection of the moon in the water for the real thing. So in a barrel or in a well, and either they do this because they're trying to trap the moon because they want more light, or they're concerned that the moon has fallen out of the sky and into the water, which is the angle I took. So I still have Shmuel Schlemiel, but he is now the father, and the protagonists are his children, Sam and Sarah, the Schlemiel kids. And then there's a series of townfolk who come up with increasingly ridiculous ideas for how they might rescue the moon from the lake. Of course, none of them work, and the kids are unable to convince the adults just to look up and see the moon still in the sky. So they have to come up with kind of a sneaky way to be helpful, to outsmart the adults and make everything work out all right in the end.
And so you've obviously tried it out on your kid, right?
Yes, I was very afraid he wouldn't laugh, but he did. So
nothing like having your beta reader right there, right?
Absolutely.
And you've got a book party coming up?
Yes, so on the 28th, this Sunday at Sister Cider House, it's open to anyone. We'll do a story time at 1 o'clock. So anyone who has kiddos that you want to bring, come on by at 1. If you're an adult and you maybe want to, just pick up a copy as a gift for a child in your life. If you want to wait till you're welcome to come for story time. But if you don't want to come for story time, you can pop by about 1:30. I'll be there till 3 signing and having cake. You can pick up a great local cider and just celebrate.
Oh, that sounds like fun. And you have plans for other books like this?
I hope so. I don't have a contract for future ones yet, but I do have a wonderful, very supportive publisher. And I do have another story in the works.
Of course you do. I mean, that's the cool thing. It's like mining a traditional source like that. You have not unlimited, but certainly a huge number to choose from. And, I think as grandparents, a lot of us get in these situations where we've dug out the books that we read to our kids, or we had maybe read to us. I mean, I have books in my collection that were my childhood books. So I'm in my 70s. Let's be clear, but then you start reading them and you start going, oh, like even Babar, right? Mm-hmm. So we ended up making new words and pasting them over the old words in some instances, right? Because you use the pictures and kind kind of, but I was thinking about that in terms of, what you're doing, that kind of reinventing wonderful classics means a lot. I mean, because so many of them are incredibly misogynistic, or they are racist, or they
Hmm.
are, super sexist in weird ways, or there are just so many things where you read them and you're just like cringing and thinking, but I loved this book as a child, right? And,
Hmm.
and so it's like thinking into like I think that underlines that we have changed as a culture a great deal
Hmm.
in the last, decades for sure. But even I would say we've had a really accelerated path in the last 5 years or more. There's just been a lot going on in the world. And so it's like finding ways to create fresh, compelling stories for kids that also are rooted in tradition. Like that's a cool, I love that idea because, like I said, we have run into the issues with families saying, we don't know how to make our culture relevant to kids. They don't actually care. And I think, wow, okay, so years ago, we didn't have the option of opting out of our culture.
Mm.
It was just, but now people move all the time and there's so much else out there. So I love this that you're really thinking about creating a much more contemporary tone to it, but saving the humor, saving the relationships, like keeping the sense of, but you're all about community in a lot of ways in your writing. And I imagine that is part of what you want to put forward in these kid books too, right?
That's very true. I mean, as we were talking about my library work, right? Community is really the driving force in a lot of my life, in my work, and in who I am as a human being. So absolutely, that's a factor in my writing. Um, but yeah, I think we don't have to be so rigid with our traditions, right? Like, what are the things that are at the core? And in the case of things like Helm folk tales, in this case, it's Jewish joy, right? It's humor.
Mm.
It's recognizing that there are many, many books that have a message or that help kids deal with anti-Semitism or that teach kids about holidays and traditions, and those are all wonderful and needed. And it's so important that we just have space to celebrate and enjoy our culture, to find it fun, right? To recognize that it's not all serious all the time. And in fact, right, we as a culture, I think Jews really pride ourselves on our humor and really have have developed a unique sense of humor in response to being in a world that is not always very welcoming to us. So, that's the core. That's the piece that's important to keep. And changing the set dressing, right? Like changing the setting and thinking about how might new characters or different characters fit in, right? Bringing it into a modern setting. That change is helpful. It keeps the important stuff alive, and it's not a betrayal, right? I think sometimes we feel like, well, if my kids' traditions don't look exactly like mine, right? If it's not that giant seder with 100 people, then it's that's the only way to do it, and it's not. It's okay to let things evolve. They've evolved to get to where we are, so they can keep evolving.
Exactly. And, one issue I've had, when I worked at the library and of course with my own kids and grandkids and stuff is a lot of books that are trying to teach us to be respectful of their cultures are so heavy-handed. I'm sorry. They're like super earnest and it's just not, it's like clunk, clunk, clunk. And you're like, yeah, but who wants to read that? And I love the fact that you're making sure that humor and joy is really strong piece of that, of the core of those stories. And so making sure that carries forward, I think that is really kind of enticing, right? And yeah, that's that's an interesting point that it's like I used to think it should be criminal to write history in a boring way. Like that's just wrong.
Yeah,
And the
right.
same with a lot of traditions. It's like, how can you make something so vibrant and awesome, dull and kind of guilt-ridden? So I
Mm-hmm.
love this joyfulness you're kind of calling out.
Thank you.
I guess I would also say, like, when you're working with other librarians, I'm sure when you were looking at inclusion and diversity, some of that issue is going to come up of like, I get all these books, but nobody wants to read them because I used to hear that. And it's like,
Mm.
well, what's the tone of that book, right? And do you feel like as a librarian, are we seeing more books that are a little lighter and brighter? Or what do you think about that?
That's interesting. So I also review picture books for some trade publications. So I do get to see a little bit of like what are the trends and what's coming. And I do agree with you that I see a lot of that as you put it, heavy-handedness, where it's kind of like here's the moral, and parents like those books, kids do not like those books, right? Like they can smell that a mile away that that they're not reading for fun. It's like eat your vegetables, right? And you can you can sort of only shove things down people's throats, right? So much. At some point, they have to want it and like it. So I wish I could say that I was seeing more of that kind of having those ideas embedded in a good story, but I do still see a very strong stream of like, I have a point to make and I'm just going to kind of thinly layer a story on top of it, just to make it a little palatable. So I hope there are of course many wonderful books coming out. So I hope we can continue to lift those up and find those, and we don't have to feel like there always needs to be like a big blazing neon moral for a book to be full of social and emotional and cultural learning.
Well, and it occurs to me maybe you in your position could do some workshops for editors, right? Because they're the ones who kind of drive that home sometimes. It's like, hey, we need a book on, can you just knock it out? And there's a lot of writers who have written 60 or 80 or 100 kid books. I mean, you know that, right? And yeah, I can do one on, but to kind of make sure that, I mean, I really like this idea of the joy and the humor being strong in all of, I mean, I noticed that like in with our Suquamish neighbors, we have been really fortunate to have Barbara Lawrence, who's a social historian and cultural historian and an amazing storyteller. And all the stories she tells have humor and have joy. And it's like that is what I think maybe keeps traditions alive. And maybe when we get rigid in them or earnest or moralistic, that's when they're much less apt to be passed along, because really, who's so attracted to that, right?
Yeah.
But it's like the education, it's like you're writing books for librarians. I'm just sort of dreaming into like kind of doing a symposium on like, how do we get the books we need as librarians? And you have to talk to the publishing industry, you have to talk to the writers, right?
I will say there's a lot of power in librarians, in booksellers, and really in individual readers, right? That when you make choices about what you read, right, that's driving some of what the public, that's, you know, what you buy and or encourage your library or your bookstores to carry. You're driving, right, the decisions that are being made. So you know, the publishing industry is watching that. So the more that we all of us as readers and as parents and grandparents are asking for these kinds of books, that's what allows us to see them. And when we've seen the explosion of more diverse voices in publishing in the last, you know, 5 to 10 years, that's a lot of that has been grassroots. That's, you know, people saying we need diverse books, we need more voices, right? We need people telling their own stories from their own cultures, right? We need own voices. We need to see, you know, every kid needs to be able to see protagonists who look like them, and needs to be able to see protagonists who look like other kids. So we've made a huge dent through our advocacy, through our voices, and through our choices. So anyone who is a reader can have that impact on the publishing industry.
No, that's right. You know, we do this Bainbridge Island Reads program, right? And the last choice we had was Braiding Sweetgrass, which you're probably familiar with that book. Wonderful. Robin Waldheimer. And we took eight sessions out of that and had over 550 people participate at one point or another, right? Which was amazing. Often though, you know, not a ton in the moment, but lots of times after, and great conversations that came out of it. But one of the things I noticed about that book was there was a statement in it from the Milkweed Press. I have a very old copy that came out like in 2014 or something. And it was given to me by my daughter-in-law, and already had like 10 names on the inside of the front page of people who'd read that copy, right? But the newer copies have this statement from the publisher that the runaway success of that book, which nobody envisioned, has led them to create a way to let voices be heard that no one would have ever published before. This enormous diversity of authors being free, right? So it's like, you're right. Like if a success like that, if the publisher chooses, can be turned into an incredible power for bringing new voices forward, which I think is just awesome. And that's something, you know, again, I know as a working at the library, when you hand people a book, it's, you know, what the booksellers call a hand sell, right? You hand it over and you go, I think you're going to really like this. And that goes around in amazing ways, and better than an ad campaign, probably, really, right? So it's like, if you're trying to influence, you got to influence the influencers, right? But I'm curious, do you, when you do talks and programs, do you talk to like groups, you know,
Yeah, mhm.
Say a little about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for kids, it's fun to get to bring my library skills together with the author side of my life and deliver story time for kids. So I have some happening around the county, including one at the Bainbridge Library on May 22nd at their normal story time slot. So for folks who are able to make that, but I also have weekend things going on. So I'll come to libraries, to bookstores, to private events. I would love to come into some more classrooms. And we can, do a deep dive into humor and folk tales and storytelling, and really use all of our faculties, learn in a lot of different ways, with singing, with play, with craft. So I love to do that. I can also talk to adults about kind of the process of writing and what it looks like to publish a children's book, but I do have a soft spot for presenting and sharing with kids.
Well, and I'm thinking about, we have 1,700 members in the senior center, right? And like most of us are grandparents or even great grandparents at this point. So it's like having a source for finding good, you know, great books the kids are going to love, but they're also books that we're going to feel really good about reading aloud to them over and over. Like that's something I'm really interested in too. Maybe we could, you know, and yeah, like if you have a short list of things that like writers or books, so I'd love to hear
Oh
that.
yeah, I'll put one together for you. I love that.
Great.
A few favorites. Mhm.
Yeah. Like what does your kid like to hear most of all, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I'll have to
remember
admit that right now, what my kid really wants is like early readers about Legos. But that's probably not what I'm going to recommend to the grandparents.
right, exactly. They get really fascinated about, I remember one of my kids was in a dirigible phase and just
Yeah.
wanted to read about dirigibles. And I think he was like in first grade and wanted to read about war weapons and all this stuff. And this is the gentlest child on God's green earth. But the librarian sort of said, "Are you concerned about this?" And I was like, "No, I think he's just a little nerd. It's like pick something and run with it." Um, but yeah, it's they get a thing and they want to learn a lot about it. And who doesn't want to feed that wonderful curiosity, right? And keep it alive.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, what advice would you give a parent, a grandparent, or great grandparent? Like, how do we keep kids reading?
Mhm. Let them read what they want. I like let them read the silly early readers about Legos, right? Or Batman, or the branded characters. Or I think sometimes we feel kind of this pressure to give our kids the quote unquote good, right, literature.
Well, yeah.
And of course, we want things that are good in that they're stimulating and interesting and exciting, right? But don't feel like everything has to be a classic, right? Or that everything has to be a brilliant piece of literature. Um, all reading is good reading, right? If your kids are excited about it, if it's going to get them engaging with books, sitting and reading with you, sitting and thinking, for themselves, um, that's a doorway, right? That is just another step into the amazing world of books and reading. So encourage their interests, whatever they are, support those interests wherever they are, and don't worry so much about making the sort of the perfect educational choice.
Well, and interestingly, I've noticed that my grandkids are really interested in some of the manga, which has a lot of diverse characters in it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And even some of the Marvel comic stuff, they have a much more diverse cast than they did in my day, I'll tell you what. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like whether you're looking for that or not, it's actually probably more effective to have it coming in sideways like that, where it's not a moral story about we should all be nice to each other, even if they don't look like us. It's just like there happen to be characters that are whatever, all different kinds of things, right? That's more powerful, I think, really.
Yeah. And I'll actually share. So in my book, in the Schlemiel Kids Save the Moon, it is an interracial family and a very diverse town. And that never comes up. It's never in the text. I did specify it to the illustrator, like it was very intentional. But it's just saying this is what our world looks like, and that's accurate, right? That's not an agenda. That just is what our world looks like, and so it should be reflected in our books. And what you're saying makes me think of, as we're in a time, and luckily this is something I haven't seen very much of and wouldn't expect to see very much of here on Bainbridge, but in the world generally, we're seeing an enormous spike in censorship, right? An
Yeah.
enormous spike in attempts to get books, especially books for kids, pulled off the shelves in public libraries, in schools. and even starting to see attempts to get them banned from bookstores just to make them completely unavailable to kids. And a lot of times the books that are targeted are exactly the kind of books you're describing that just normalize, right, having an identity that is outside what you might think of as the traditional mainstream, right? For years, this is not true anymore. Well, right now, the most banned and challenged book in the country, according to the American Library Association, is A Genderqueer by Maria Kobabe. For many, many years, it was And Tango Makes Three.
Oh, I love that book.
Isn't it wonderful? Yeah. For those who might not be familiar, it's an old picture book. It's a true story. It's creative nonfiction about two gay penguins at the Central Park Zoo, just two male penguins who coupled and were able to raise an egg together. They were given an abandoned egg and raised a chick named Tango. True story. And yeah. It's just a story about penguin dads, right? Like there's no talking about the fact. It's just like, oh, okay, well, they don't have an egg because it turns out they're both male. And so here's an egg and let's see what happens. And that was the thing that people seized on, is like, that is what is dangerous. That's what we need to ban and censor, is just this idea that there are many ways of being in the world and they're all normal and they're all okay.
Exactly. And Genderqueer is sort of that book too. So yeah, I have a group called Transfriending that sort of is a soft landing for families whose kids are gender questioning or exploring or who are going through transition of various kinds. And, we're all going through transition of various kinds all the time. I'm in my 70s, and let me tell you, I'm transitioning seriously from being someone who can bend and stoop all day to someone who maybe shouldn't be doing that quite so much. So, there's such a range, and it's like the idea that there are many spectrums and we're all on there somewhere. I think that is just so fascinating that that it's very difficult for some people to accept that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really becoming very interested in neurodiversity starting to be more acceptable and more discussed, and how there's actually superpowers to it. It's not, but things that had been traditionally like, we don't want to talk about that, or there's assumptions about limitations that may or might not be there. So I think, normalizing is just such a healthy, wholesome way to, engage people in broadening, like widening our windows, right?
I can't help it. I have to make a couple of book recommendations. So for families that have young kiddos where there is transitioning happening, there's a great book called When Aiden Became a Brother. And it's sort of in the vein of like a new baby coming home sort of books, like how does a sibling cope with having a new sibling, except in this case, instead of having a new baby come home, it's a sibling transitioning. So that's a really great one. And then thinking about that neurodiversity piece, there's a middle grade book by a semi-local author. They're based in Olympia, Deke Moulton, and then it's a new book just coming out called Benji Zeb is a Ravenous Werewolf.
Oh, cool.
And Benji is a big piece of the plot is driven by Benji has a lot of anxiety and has some sensory issues that are kind of like, very, very overwhelmed in certain types of situations and like needs a little space. So there's nothing preachy about it. It's not like, and now here is a book about a Jewish kid who also happens to be a werewolf. And is neurodiverse in some ways. It's just like, he just is. That's just who he is.
Oh, that's perfect. And the thing is, there's a lot of overlap in so many isms, right? And that getting this kind of book that's like, it's like what you said before. If there's a book and you don't recognize anybody in it as being like you, it doesn't engage you very much. But if you can see that there are people and not like having it hammered home, but just like that's part of the normalizing, isn't it? I think that's awesome. Yeah, if you have any other kinds of thoughts like that, please come right out, right? Sheila.
Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey. This has been wonderful. I was thinking a couple things. Asked about how to get kids reading. The best way I know how to get the kids reading is to read to them themselves, to read to them. When my grandkids were younger and they stay overnight with me, that was part of the tradition was before they went to bed, we all hung out on my small little bed and I read to them. And one of the I read to them quite a few different things. A lot of them were classics, I have to admit. But the one that to me, that I see as diverse and a classic is the right. What am I? Wind in the Willows.
Mhm.
Because that's got all the different types of people and characters in it. And still, to me, whenever we get to the part where Bertie is lost, which is a thing that can be talked about, and what do Ratty and they go out in their little canoe to find him, and they hear this music, which is, again, it's ethereal. It's something that kids can understand and they can grab hold of. And they know about that kind of music. They've heard that kind of music. And of course, it's great, the great God Pan, which of course they probably would take that off the shelves immediately, if not sooner, because I mean, you don't want anybody having anything to do with other than the whatever God you're supposed to be doing. And I still can't read that part without weeping, literally weeping. It's so beautifully done. And I remember with my grandkids when I was reading it, and the tears start flowing with me. They look at me and say, oh, oh, yeah, it's an amazing thing. So thank you again, Audrey. It brings all kinds of wonderful memories for me, especially when my grandkids were here with me. Loved it, loved it.
You know, my grandkids are no longer around as much because they've moved away, but we have a thing of reading on Friday nights by FaceTime, which is kind of cool. They get on the sofa and they have the blankets that I knitted for them and they snuggle up. And I mean, we're just looking at each other and I'm reading, but it's like a visit. And the cats come and go and this and that. And they say, wait, I have a question. Let's talk about this or that. But it's so fun because we really, and then it's long books. So sometimes it takes us a couple months to get through the whole thing. And I always say, now, do you remember where we were? And they do remember, and I don't. So it's, right? But it's just a way to kind of stay like, it just keeps us in touch in a really sweet way. And it's like before bedtime, and then daddy will come in and say, okay, you guys, I think it's time. And they're like, no, one more chapter. Right. But it's so sweet. And it makes me feel like I'm still part of their life in an important way.
Yep.
It's such a bond, right? Who doesn't love to read to their kids? But this thing about banning books really concerns me because it's that control issue obviously is a huge part of it, but it's also just like denying the great wonderfulness, the huge range of wonder that is the world, right?
Yeah.
What do you do as a librarian? Like, do you have ways to handle that kind of stuff?
I mean, that is like, how much time do we have? That's I mean, that's like not even an hour in itself. That's like a whole day in itself. But there absolutely are, there are very specific things that libraries and libraries and schools do. And often it's really about what you do before you see a challenge. And that's about, there are very clear policies in place at libraries and in the schools about what books are coming in and how do you make decisions, right? We can't buy every book as much as you would like to. You can't keep everything on the shelf forever because there's no room for the wonderful new things. So how do you make these decisions about what comes in, what goes out? And there are very clear policies, there are clear standards, there's both around the quality of a book, as like, is it well written, is it well reviewed, is it a good physical quality, is it relevant to the community? So all of these things are taken into consideration. So there's a lot of professional judgment that goes into every book that kids are finding on the shelves. So challenges often when they come in, you can be very clear about why that particular book was selected, why it's valuable, how it provides a meaningful perspective that might otherwise be lacking or underrepresented in the collection. So intellectual freedom is a core value of libraries and library workers and librarians. So we are out here, librarians are out there on the front lines of that battle every day.
Yeah, and that has to be kind of tough. So yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot because I remember here at our library, they had several times there'd been a shelf of these books are banned somewhere. right? And then a whole bunch of, like, if you want to look at them and try to figure out why on earth they're banned, or it's like, that's sort of wonderful too. That brings awareness to the, uh, just that whole movement or willfulness. I don't even know how to describe it. Of like, who are you going to tell me what I can read and what I can't read? And yet, it's currently a happening thing, right?
Yep.
So, and wasn't there was a library in Washington that was getting threatened with being shut down. What was that? Do you remember?
Yes, and I can't remember the town that it was in now, but it was a small town with a single location library, and people were objecting to having, I believe it was LGBTQIA plus content on the shelves, in particular books, and when the books were not removed because they comply with the library's collection development policy and therefore should be there. When those books were not removed, there was a movement to just completely defund the library, to remove all of its funding so that the library would have to close entirely. And that failed, thankfully. And I believe there were some regulatory changes that make it more difficult for that particular situation to happen again in the state. That one was a little complex because of the service area and who that library was serving in particular. And that is a very real threat. There are libraries around the country that are facing that kind of threat.
And that is scary, isn't it, Sheila?
Well, people are I think the basic behind all of this is fear.
Mhm.
Fear. And I mean, I think that's what it ends up having. And then, of course, everybody gets angry because fear leads to anger. And just uh, if some concept of the fear can be dissuaded or done down, then I think it makes a lot of difference.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think we could all use a dimmer switch in the entire
Mhm.
country and maybe worldwide. Like, let's just take it down a notch or two so people can think. Because you're right, it serves some interest to have people stirred up and crazy because it's easier to herd people if they're frightened,
Yeah.
as we know historically. But I think, one of the strengths of media, is that people all over the world can hear other views for the first time ever. And that's pretty darn powerful. I mean, some incredible percentage of the world has a cell phone now, like
Mhm.
huge, right? And even
Maybe,
in countries, go ahead, Jen.
yeah. In fact, that brings me to something I would like to ask. And since we're getting close to the end anyway, talk to us about how you see the future of libraries, since it's changed so much since the three of us, other than you, were kids. We didn't have computers in those days. We had black and white TVs. I mean, what do
No, we
you
did have TV.
envision? And some didn't have TVs. We had a phonograph. Anyway, so could you give us a sense of how the librarians are using these issues today to branch out to the library, perhaps being a center of knowledge that is different from what many of us would be used to?
Absolutely. I do think it's kind of a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same, because the fundamentals, the way things look might be different, right? You're going to see computers, you're going to see a lot of interactive play spaces in libraries, right? Space being used for gathering and interacting and hands-on learning rather than kind of being a shushed temple for books, right? So it does look different in many ways on the outside, but at the heart, it is about empowering people with knowledge, empowering people the with the ability to pursue what their interests, what they care about, to find themselves, to see what's out there in the world. We may do it in different ways, but we still stand for that, and we still stand very strongly, as we always have, for every person's right to make those decisions for themselves. Although this particular moment, right, in book banning is new in some ways, the need to stand up for people's right to make their own choices, that is very enduring.
So, I remember when you and I were both at the library here on the island, there was a big movement to say there weren't going to be any more books. They were taking down those floor to ceiling shelves and bringing in these short shelves. And it's like, we're in 20 years or in 10 years, I can't remember what it was supposed to be. There were supposed to be no more books. But I mean, I don't see books ever going away. Do you?
I mean, certainly not in your lifetime or in mine. Who knows what comes eventually, but no, I mean, books are still the core of why people turn to libraries. People still love books. Books are still the best way to access many kinds of information, or the best way to learn in many cases. So right, I'm a digital native, if you want to put it that way, right? I'm a millennial. The computers and the internet were available from fairly early on in my childhood. Give me a print cookbook any day. Right? I want a beautiful glossy image, right? I want to be able to follow it with my finger. It's enjoyable, right? For reading with my kid as a parent, give me a physical picture book over a digital copy any day of the week. So books are still the best way to do many things. I do think in libraries, right, there's some change in terms of recognizing there are many ways that people want to use libraries. And so there does have to be a balance between, right, there's a safety issue around shelf height, for example, like you need to be able to see people, and that makes the library safer. People want to use the space for meeting, for play. You need to make room for some of those computers, right? So there's shifts in kind of how the space itself is used. But that core idea that libraries are about books and learning, and that we're rooted in that physical experience of bringing people together in a physical place with physical objects, that's not going away.
And yet I can see virtual reality goggles becoming something that you'll be able to use at the library.
Absolutely.
I grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, and we had a Carnegie library that was incredible. This big rotunda and, shelves up to here and just stacks endless up and down and multi-stairs. And it was huge and amazing. And of course, it was full of Concord authors. So there was, Henry Thoreau's diaries, journals were open, different years, but the same day, like whatever. And you'd read what he was doing that day on such and such a year. And there's a Louisa Alcott room was the children's library, right? And all the first editions of her books in these glass cases. And it just incredible, right? And that to me was like the haven of my childhood. Going to the library saved my life as a weird, nerdy, super introverted kid. It was like, give me this. I just thought it was like heaven, right? But I realized for today's kids, they do get drawn to a lot of other things. There's a Lego table, or there's a map, and there's puzzles and stuff like that. And that's great too. But just being around books, like seeing books on the shelf, I feel like that somehow, here's what my grandkids' corner, right? And it's as full as it can hold of all kinds of books and stuff for them. It just sets a tone, kind of, right? That children who grow up in homes with books tend to read more, right?
Absolutely. And not only do they read more, I want to go back to what Sheila was saying earlier, their parents read to them more, right? If books are handy, whether they're ones you own, whether they're ones you've picked up from the library, I'll put a little shout out for Imagination Library. If people aren't familiar with that, that is a service that Dolly Parton funds, actually, that will send a free book to your home each month if you have kids under a certain age. I think it's 8 or 9. I could be wrong about that, but it's available to anyone living in Kitsap County at this point. So you can have books in your home. It doesn't have to cost you anything, but that's when a parent, right, will pick up a book and read with a kid even before, they're old enough to do that themselves. And that's how they learn to associate books with love. And that positions them for a lifelong love of reading and learning.
Right.
Oh, Audrey, that is a beautiful thought. And that might be the thought to take home with us. Does anybody have a last question? Marcy, did you want to say anything or ask a question, or maybe not? Anyway, thank you so much for your time and this wonderful, provocative, interesting, far-reaching conversation. This is great, and we really appreciate it. And I'll see you on Sunday at the Cider House, right?
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Anne. This has been a joy.
We'll all watch for your book, and we'll look for future episodes for your wonderful thoughts about preserving the cultures in humor. Thank you.
I'll just say the name one more time. It's the Schlemiel Kids Save the Moon, and you can find it now at Eagle Harbor Books, as far as well as anywhere books are sold or borrowed.
Excellent. Sounds fabulous. Thanks a lot. And I'll stop the recording now.
Okie doke.
If I can figure out how.
Good thing we
so
can.
Long.
Anyway, thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Anne. This was lovely.